Braelon Allen replacing Breece Hall as lead back, a position change for Joe Tippmann, and sneaky defensive line depth. Let's do some 2025 bold predictions. Locked On Jets begins now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, August 14th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, I'm going to make some bold predictions for the New York Jets in 2025. They will be about the defensive line, the offensive line, and the running back position. Now, I'm not saying that I am predicting all of these things to happen. What I'm saying is I think there's a better chance that people realize that these three things could happen. And I'd give all of them maybe like a 1 in 3 chance, which means that the odds are pretty good that one of these three things will happen during the course of the regular season. And the parallel I would draw is the 2024 season Jamie and Sherwood had, because nobody really thought that that was going to happen. If I told you on August 14th, 2024, that 1 year later, Jamie and Sherwood would be the starting middle linebacker for the New York Jets and on a $15 million contract, not a lot of people would have believed that. And fewer would have believed. Jets fans would be pretty happy with that. But Sherwood had an outstanding 2024 season. However, if you looked closer where the Jets were a year ago, there was a better chance that people realized that Sherwood would take over the linebacker position because CJ Mosley was aging. There was a chance Mosley would get injured. And Sherwood had quietly improved his play through his first 3 years in the league and become a high-end backup. And he was on an upward trajectory. So maybe it should not have surprised us that Sherwood broke out in 2024 as much as it did. So I'm going to give you three bold predictions. I think one of these three things has a good chance of happening this year. I'm not sure which of the three, but I think one of these three things we'll look back and say, you know what? All the signals were there before the season started. Now, my first bold prediction involves the Jets running backs. And it's that Braelon Allen takes over for Breece Hall as the number one running back. And when I say that, I'm not saying Breece Hall is going to be unproductive. I'm not saying that Breece Hall is suddenly going to be off the team, because I actually think Allen and Hall could be a really dynamic duo at the running back position. And I look back at the Jets last year, and there were a million problems on offense. And there were so many problems on offense that we kind of like lost track of them not handling the running back position all that well. You have a guy who's really a power back in Braelon Allen, a guy who's, a guy who really likes to drive the pile, a guy who likes to play north-south. And then you have Breece Hall, who's a speed back. And on paper, these guys should complement each other really well. And the Jets never really figured out how to properly maximize both of them. The Jets never really figured out how to use the duo to complement each other. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the Jets struggled to do this, because the offensive coaching last year was absolutely miserable. We started the season with Nathaniel Hackett, who was demoted after, and you could arguably say he was kind of like quiet fired after 5 games, because the Jets stripped him of his play calling duty, and it wasn't really clear what he was doing after that point. It was almost like he was fired. He had all of his responsibilities taken from him, but because Aaron Rodgers was around, they didn't want to actually send him out of the building. And Todd Downing took over. Todd Downing's not a very good offensive coordinator. If we're going to be honest, Todd Downing's one of the worst offensive coordinators in football. We didn't really appreciate that, though, because compared with Hackett, he looks like a genius. Compared with Hackett, Downing looked like Andy Reid. But compared with other NFL offensive coordinators, Downing's really not that great himself. And then a guy who was the Jets' run game coordinator, Keith Carter, their offensive line coach, maybe one of the worst offensive line coaches in the league. And the more I think this through, the more it seems to me Breece Hall is kind of been miscast by the Jets. The Jets kind of have him as a lead back, a do-it-all kind of guy. And I myself have kind of leaned into this. But I don't know that Breece is really best suited for that role. he's a home run hitter, and I think that's one of the reasons the Jets want to give him the ball so much is that he's one of the few players on the roster who can rip off a 25 yard gain. A guy with amazing speed and almost deceptive speed because he looks so effortless when he runs the ball. You're not expecting him to like beat a guy to a corner, and then he does it easily. And we all have memories of Breece Hall's 2022 rookie season, that first half when he averaged close to 6 yards per carry. He looked like one of the best backs in the NFL. But Breece also has some flaws. I think for a back of his size, he doesn't always run with the power you want him to run with. He's a big back, but doesn't always run like a big back. And he's also, some people say indecisive. I just think he's not great at reading blocks behind the line of scrimmage. People compare him to Le'Veon Bell for because they say he's patient. I think there's a difference between being patient and indecisive. And I think Breece might be a back who's best used in a certain way. Meanwhile, Braelon Allen, there are some question marks with him. Braelon Allen started the 2024 season very hot. He had a great first 4 weeks. And then after that, really was not that productive except in short yardage situations. He was pretty good at converting like the 3rd and 1s, the 4th and the 4th and 1s, the 3rd and 2s. Other than that, though, he really was not all that productive. But the Jets didn't really give him a big opportunity in a lot of these games. And it's very possible a back like Allen, who's kind of a battering ram, could be more productive when you give him a higher volume of carries. And looking at this Jets backfield, I wonder, is it possible that the Jets are better off with Allen as the lead back? This was something I wondered early last season when Allen got off to a good start and Hall was struggling. Then after the first 4 or 5 weeks, Hall played better and Allen was struggling. And maybe we undersold how poor of a job the Jets did figuring out how to use these backs to complement each other. Because on paper, Allen's strengths and weaknesses really complement Breece's strengths and weaknesses, and vice versa. Allen's the guy you run between the tackles. He's a tough runner. Whereas Breece is a guy you want to run more on the outside. You're trying to hit the home runs with him. Both guys can catch the ball out of the backfield, and that's going to help. It's especially going to help a Jets offense that is really lacking at the wide receiver position after Garrett Wilson. But I think Hall is probably the more skilled of the two as a receiver. Hall, and part of this is Hall's the home run hitter. So you're more apt to want to throw Breece screens because Breece is the type of guy who's more likely to break a 25, 30-yard play off a catch on a screen. So when I talk about Braelon Allen potentially taking over the lead back role for Breece Hall, that doesn't mean that Breece is going to be irrelevant. I think it's the type of thing that could make Breece better. I think the Jets potentially could have like one of those 1-2 punches where you have two really good backs who you utilize, both of whom bring different skills to the table. Allen's the guy you want on the tough runs, the inside runs. Breece is the guy you want to utilize in the passing game, more of the finesse runner. And I think the types of runs you give them are also going to be different. And this is going to be counterintuitive. I think that Allen's a guy who actually might do better on zone runs. And zone runs, people tend to think of those as more finesse runs because the back is kind of waiting at the line of scrimmage for a hole to open, and then the back needs to be decisive and hits it. Allen's a decisive runner, though. And if you go back to his college career, he actually was a little bit more productive, or at least as productive on zone runs as he was gap runs. Whereas Breece, you think of him more of a finesse runner, and gap plays tend to be the ones where you're like pulling the guard. They tend to be viewed as more power plays, but they don't require the running back to make as much of a read. It's more just get to the hole as fast as possible. And I think Breece would succeed more with those runs on when they do ask him to run between the tackles. But I do think Breece is probably better off on more outside runs, trying to hit the home run. I think this could be a running back duo that could be really productive. And I think the Jets might want to consider getting away from Breece Hall being the do-it-all back, the number one guy, because that just might not be his game. He might be better served. And when I say he might be better served as a complement to a number one back like Allen, that's not a knock on Breece Hall. You can have a guy who's a complement back as part of a tandem, be a really important part of the offense and a really productive part of the offense. And I think that that's something that very well could happen with the New York Jets in 2025. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'm going to reopen an old debate, and I'm going to offer you the counterpoint to an argument that I've been making, because I may have changed my mind about where Joe Tippmann's best utilized for this team. I've been arguing center a lot, but the more I think about it, the more I think Tippmann might be more valuable to the Jets at guard. And I'll explain to you why as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. You're already following the action, so why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. Of course, baseball season is in full swing, although we're not really happy with the way our New York teams are playing right now. It's like the Yankees and Mets are trying to outdo each other, who could have the most disappointing summer. Well, if you want to get in on the action for Major League Baseball, FanDuel's there. You could also look ahead to the NFL season. We're just a couple of weeks away. Jets over under 5.5 wins on FanDuel. Again, it's the best way to get in on the action. Are you new to FanDuel? Well, new customers can bet $5 and get just $150 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Again, open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we're doing bold predictions on the 2025 New York Jets season. So we started by talking about the running back position. Now I'd like to move to the offensive line. And I will tell you that I'm actually beginning to change my mind on an important topic for the Jets on the offensive line. And that's where Joe Tippmann could be best utilized for this football team. Now, if you've been listening to this show for a long time, you know that I've been very much of the mindset that Tippmann has proven himself as a quality center in this league. And I've been saying they should keep him at center. And a lot of this goes back to the whole Elijah Vera Tucker saga. As you probably remember, AVT was drafted in 2021. The Jets played him at left guard his first year. Year two comes. The Jets have signed Laken Tomlinson, who's used to playing left guard. So AVT moves over to right guard. Then injuries happen during the season. AVT ends up playing left tackle. Then he ends up playing right tackle, and he gets hurt. 2023 comes. AVT starts at right guard. Injuries and ineffective play happen. AVT has to go back to tackle. He gets hurt again. 2024 comes. Jets just stick AVT at right guard. He has a good season, plays 15 out of 17 games. Everybody's happy. So this has been like at the forefront of my mind. You know, the Jets moved AVT around. It did not help him. He got hurt. We don't know whether he actually got hurt because he was moving around, but you just don't like the optics of that. So I look at Joe Tippmann, and he started at guard as a rookie. Then they moved him to center after Connor McGovern got hurt. He proved himself at center. I'm sitting there saying, let's not mess around with this. He's a good center. Let's keep him there. Well, last week, of course, John Simpson got hurt. So the Jets shuffled their offensive line a bit for the preseason opener against the Packers. And on the first team offense, you had Josh Myers playing center and Tippmann over at left guard. And it was only a couple of snaps, but it got me thinking. And I started to really dive into changes in the NFL. I actually wrote an article about this yesterday on GettingGreenNation.com that you can check out. But the Jets famously signed Kevin Mawai in 1998. And this was the beginning of a close to 2-decade run where the Jets had top of the league play at the center position because Mawai was a Hall of Famer. After Mawai left, the Jets drafted Nick Mangold. But I started thinking about the reason the Jets signed Kevin Mawai in 1998. And the reason was that Bill Parcells was really focused on a big nose tackle the Buffalo Bills had named Ted Washington, a guy who was 360 pounds, so a huge nose tackle. And if you think 360 pounds is big for a defensive lineman today, it was even bigger in 1998 when players were generally smaller. And Washington was the anchor of the Bills' 3-4 defense. And in a 3-4 defense, typically you have a nose tackle who lines up just right across from the center. And his job is to draw a double team. His job is to be such a force that a guard has to help the center. And when the guard has to help the center, the guard can't block his assignment. And it just kind of messes everything up. And there's this domino effect of failure for the offense. And Parcells was really worried about the impact Ted Washington would have on the Jets offense, if they didn't have a great center. And Washington was one of the dominant nose tackles of this era, but the 3-4 defense was on the rise in this era. And it was built around that big space-eating guy who lined up just across from the center and drew double teams. And having Mawai during that era gave the Jets a huge advantage. The Jets made the playoffs 4 of Mawai's 8 seasons with the team. I think it's fair to say he was one of the most important players on the team during that era, and one of the biggest reasons the Jets had success in that era, because the Jets had a center who could single block those great nose tackles in the 3-4 defense. But over time, things have changed in the NFL. And the 3-4 defense really is not in style anymore. You see teams that run their systems with elements of the 3-4, but nobody's really running the pure 3-4 anymore. And with that, it's kind of gone out the window having a defensive lineman line up directly across from the center. Now the defenses are more focused on penetrating. They're more focused on getting to the quarterback because passing is so prevalent in this league. Passing has become much more prevalent through the history of the league, but particularly within the last 20 years as they've tightened up what constitutes pass interference. So defenses don't feel generally that they have the luxury of having one big guy whose job is just to eat up blocks. They want to have 4 guys who can get to the quarterback. And Pro Football Focus actually examined this a few years ago. In the year 2022, only less than 5% of the snaps had a defensive lineman lining up directly across from the center. And that means the center doesn't really block one-on-one that much anymore. What the center does is, first of all, he helps the quarterback get the line set, make sure the snap is effective, and then he helps out. He either helps a guard with a double team or he takes on a blitzer coming up the middle. And I started thinking about Tippmann, and I saw, there were a couple of really dominant snaps he had at the guard position Saturday night against Green Bay. Tippmann's a really big guy. Tippmann's a really strong guy. Tippmann's a dominant blocker. He's not really getting a lot of one-on-ones at the center position. And not only that, but I don't know how much you gain by having a really good center in Tippmann over a guy who's just okay like Josh Myers. I think Tippmann's better than Josh Myers, but how much better does it make the Jets to have a really good center versus someone who's just okay? I'm not sure the difference is that great. And I wonder whether Tippmann might be better off just a guard where he'll get a lot of these one-on-ones where the Jets will be able to utilize his blocking skills. The skills Tippmann has at center, and he's a good center, but I think that they're very repeatable. I think it's not that hard to find a guy who can pretty much do a reasonable imitation of Tippmann at center. It's not easy to find a guy who could do an imitation at guard of what Tippmann's capable of doing. Tippmann's capable of being a really big impact guy at guard. And in my article, the point that I made was that even though Tippmann's a better center than Myers, and even though John Simpson's a pretty good player, there's a case to be made that the drop-off from Tippmann to Myers is less than the gain from Simpson to Tippmann. Going from good center to okay center, I don't know if it impacts the team that much. Going from good guard to better guard might have a bigger impact. Now, I think we all know right now the Jets are not going to start the season by changing their offensive lineman. Simpson's back in the mix. At this point, the starting offensive line is looking like Fashanu, Simpson, Tippmann, AVT, and Membu from left to right. But I wonder if at some point during the season, there's a shuffle, and maybe there's an injury that makes the Jets push Tippmann back to guard. Because I do think what we've seen is that the Jets, if there's an injury at guard, the Jets are going to prefer to put Myers at center and Tippmann at guard. And there's probably a reason for that, because Tippmann has a bigger impact at guard. And Tippmann's stronger. He's better capable of blocking one-on-one. Again, I'm not – one of the points I want to make is that these are bold predictions. I'm not predicting all these things are going to happen. What I'm saying is that I think there's probably a 1 in 3 shot of all these things happening, which means that I think one of these 3 things could happen. And I think that there's a better chance of Tippmann ending up at guard than a lot of people realize. Now, as you're on the Locked On Jets podcast, we've just talked about the offensive line. Now let's move over to the defensive line. I think there's a perception out there the Jets do not have a lot of depth at the defensive line. And based on what these players have accomplished career to date, that's fair. But it's also true that sometimes you have better depth than you realize. And a lot of it goes back to coaching. We'll discuss as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. It's the best time of year. NFL kickoff is almost here, and that means fantasy football season's back in full swing. And this year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning things up with a fantasy football experience like never before. This year, me and Locked On Jets are playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league. One of my favorite features, the new Guillotine Leagues they just dropped. Every week, the lowest scoring team is eliminated, and the last one standing wins. And to celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days through August. As I just mentioned, to kick it off, they just dropped the Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues. It's a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's one team left standing. With the season around the corner, and now it's time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. If you're more into the classics, you can still play head-to-head private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football right now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're doing some Jets bold predictions today. So my first bold prediction was that Braelon Allen could take over as the number one running back for Breece Hall in 2025, and that does not preclude Breece Hall from being an important part of the offense. My number two prediction is there could be a shuffle on the Jets offensive line at some point during the season, and Joe Tippmann might end up being more valuable to the New York Jets at guard than at center. And that's a change of position for me. It's one that I've come to by really thinking things over. I may have changed my mind a bit on that one. My third bold prediction, the Jets could end up having very good defensive line depth in the year 2025. I think right now, the perception, and something I've said myself, is that the Jets are kind of top heavy on the defensive line. They have three very good players. They have Quinnen Williams, they have Jermaine Johnson, and they have Will McDonald. The two defensive ends, McDonald and Johnson, both have questions. With McDonald, it's can the extra bulk lead him to being a more functional player setting the edge against the run? With Johnson, it's can he recover from the Achilles injury and find his old form? Because he was a very good starter for the Jets in 2023, suffered an Achilles injury at the beginning of 2024, unfortunately. And those can be career-altering injuries. Some guys bounce back, other guys have bigger trouble. But heading into the season, I think those are the three guys you're confident in. There is not as much confidence when it comes to the depth on this team. But I've been thinking this through the last couple of days, and sometimes we don't realize we have depth in the beginning. Last year was a good example. I mentioned Jamie and Sherwood. A lot of people weren't that confident with him as a backup linebacker to begin the season. But depth doesn't come from household names. Depth comes from players who are kind of under the radar surprising you and playing effectively. And I think about the Robert Saleh, Jeff Ulbrich era, which did not result in a lot of wins for the Jets, but it did result in a lot of very good defensive games. And the Jets, during the Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich player, did not really do a great job of player development. But one of the exceptions was defensive line, where a lot of young guys turned into quality players. Now, I don't give them much credit for like Jermaine Johnson or Will McDonald because these are first-round picks. Player development is not really about your first-round picks. Guys get drafted in the first round because they're either ready to play or they're close to being ready to play. I don't think coaching really impacts first-round picks all that much. But during the Saleh Ulbrich era, you had guys like John Franklin Myers and Bryce Huff. Franklin Myers went from being a waiver claim and ended up turning into a quality starter. Huff was an undrafted free agent, and they developed him into a quality situational pass rusher. And I think just as impressive is those were two guys with very different play styles. JFM was like 290 pounds. He was a power end, whereas Huff was the ultimate speed guy off the edge. So it showed that they weren't just capable of developing players who could play one style. The question comes now with Aaron Glenn, Steve Wilks, this new coaching staff. Can they have the same level of success developing defensive linemen? And there are some young guys who I do think have potential to be decent depth players. If not starters, they can at least be decent depth players. And that's really what the Jets need. Jets need guys who can play part of a rotation and still give them quality snaps while McDonald or Quinnen or Jermaine takes a break. We could start at the defensive tackle position. The guy I have my eye on is Leonard Taylor, who I felt like had a successful rookie season. And it was a success in part because it was a non-drafted free agent who made the roster, which is what you like to see. That's a good thing. Taylor ended up being the number 4 defensive tackle for the Jets, and he held his own. And again, for a non-drafted free agent, hey, that's a pretty successful signing. But the question now is, can Taylor be more? Can Taylor be a guy who's the top 3 guy in a rotation, maybe even the number 2 guy in a defensive tackle rotation? And I think a lot of this will come down to player development. And then you could look at the defensive end position. Jets have some young guys there who are not super heralded guys. You have a late round pick, Tyler Barron, who the Jets took out of Miami, previously played at Tennessee in college. A few weeks back, Alex Dono of Locked On Canes came on the show. I heard the Locked On Podcast Network. He was the Miami Hurricane show, and he gave us a great scouting report on Tyler Barron. You also have a couple of guys who were undrafted free agents who made the team last year, Braden McGregor and Eric Watts. And neither of those guys really made the impact of Taylor, but they showed enough to make the roster. on opening day as undrafted free agents, which at least shows you something. It shows you that the old coaching staff, which for all its faults was pretty good at picking out defensive linemen, thought that there was talent there. And this is really true across the league. That we talk about in our mailbag show yesterday. I had some questions: should the Jets sign Jadeveon Clowney? Should they sign Zadarius Smith? Should the Jets try and increase their depth? And these are fair questions, of course. And certainly there are guys you can sign. Sometimes bringing in a veteran does bolster your depth in a profound way. But ultimately, in big picture, the best way to build depth is through your own internal players. And the best way to build depth is to develop guys who you drafted in the late rounds or signed as undrafted free agents and turn them into quality role players. That's what the good teams do, because there are only so many older players out there. There are only so many established players out there who you can get to take on depth roles. The teams that have the best depth usually don't realize their depth at this time of year because the players haven't had the opportunity to make their mark yet in the NFL. And you only find out that you have good depth once you get into the season and you see the job the coaching staff did with these guys working on them to develop their games. And, I think for the defensive ends in particular, you had some guys who were very raw last year. I think McGregor and Watts were both very raw. I think even in the preseason when they were having success, it was more about just their physical talents taking over rather than them winning with technique. You can win in the preseason with physical talent because the guys you're playing against are sometimes practice squatters, sometimes not even practice squatters. Whereas you get into the real games, you get into the real season, you need to start winning with technique because everybody's talented in the NFL. It's easy to look at the Jets defensive line right now and say there's not a lot of depth. And it's easy to do. I can tell you it's easy to do because I've done it myself. But there's also the possibility that this group is better than we think it is because, I think heading into the 2021 season, which was Robert Saleh's first season, you may have looked at Bryce Huff or you may have looked at John Franklin Myers and been unimpressed and said the Jets don't really have a lot of depth on the defensive line. And they ended up both becoming very good players for this team. And the Jets ended up relying on both of them quite a bit during their tenures here. Even if these guys aren't as successful as JFM or Huff, they could still be quality players in a rotation. That would help the Jets out quite a bit. And it would help alleviate some of the concerns because, as we mentioned, both defensive ends are good players, but they both have some question marks to start the season. It'd be nice to have a little depth behind them to make us more confident in what the Jets have. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.